Welcome to the 2024 IDM Symposium. I'm Philip Welkhoff, Interim Director of the Institute for Disease Modeling. It is great to see you all here, and it's great to kind of be back all together. We have an amazing theme for today, and one of the themes is modeling for a chaotic world. And we had our own measure of chaos this morning. Our nanny ended up sick, Martina ended up having work travel, and my opening remarks were before her school drop-off, which is going to be in the next hour or so. So Katerina ended up tagging along to work for the opening remarks, and then I am. Then going to disappear and then be back later on. But I appreciate your kind of rolling with the general chaos, which is going to be a theme of the next couple days, I think, is where it's going to be. You know, I love this community that comes together. I love the community that comes together around modeling. I love because there's this group. This group comes together and is very focused on doing modeling really well, but also really focused on impact. Understanding that there's a big difference between having a high impact paper and having a high impact in the real world, but are really good at doing both. You know, looking around this room, seeing so many really cool things that I've read over the past year or two and saying, wow, that is like extraordinarily good work. And then seeing the follow through, because so much of the time the real work begins after the paper is published. And all of a sudden, how do we make the things that we want to see happen in the real world? Thanks so much, Katerina. What I wanted to focus on was a couple of things where things fall off between the plan that we have.
Dad,
yes, Scott.
I just want to come and find you.
Oh yeah, and you found me. And so finish your grapes, and then I will be with you in about 10 minutes. Yeah. So where we are is a lot of times we'll have, whether it's a new vaccine, a new intervention, a new drug, a new program, there's going to be a really great clinical trial. And say when we control every aspect of things, all of a sudden there's spectacular results. And then we say, now let's do this at programmatic scale. Right? We say, we're going to go here, we're going to go there, we're now going to do this not just in this district or in these controlled settings. We're going to do this across the board. And then all of a sudden we see things break down. We start seeing things scale up, and we see that the impact that we saw in the real world ends up not matching what we saw in the clinical trial. And it's because of all the things we had controlled when we generated the evidence in the first place. There are things where we find that there were systems dependencies, where all of a sudden our ability to deliver, whether it's a intervention or a standard of care, or access to something like modern contraception, was different in the trial setting compared to where we went to afterwards. It can be sometimes the fact that there's tremendous demographic heterogeneity, tremendous population heterogeneity. We see this in terms of all the social determinants of health. We see this in terms of the impact that nutrition has on kind of the outcomes to so many different factors, whether it's infectious diseases, whether it's non-communicable diseases, even in terms of all the knock-on effects in terms of health and access and resilience. We see all kinds of individual factors, whether it's, adherence or access or behavioral things that sometimes are required as far as things happen. And so these things have been known for a long time. Each kind of domain has their own kind of way of describing what's going on. I've been collecting some of these different perspectives on things over the last few months. You know, there's very well worked out implementation science in some corners. There's a lot of work in terms of talking about the fall off between efficacy and real world effectiveness in other places. One of my favorite quotes, which was from a very much a non-health and development field, was, amazing. That's such a good host. Amateurs talk strategy and tactics, professionals discuss logistics, where you can have some really great ideas and amazing strategy, all your worked outside tactics. Very good. But in the real world, it's going to be, can you pull things off logistically? Can you make all the nitty-gritty pieces work? That's going to determine whether or not you have impact. And of course, the most succinct version of this was by the noted philosopher Mike Tyson, which was, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. The real world has a way of doing that to us. And I think one of the key themes around how do we model in an increasingly challenging and chaotic environment is all the things that can and go wrong are going to be, it's going to be all those challenges that we've been dealing with, but more so. As we look at the backdrop of climate change, of increasing conflict, of the fiscal and economic crises that are happening in so many different countries, our job is getting harder. Yeah, this is a great place to sit. Yeah, hop in.
I need somewhere to sit.
All right.
I sat in a chair on the little seat.
All right. So then when we continue on, we as modelers and analysts, we believe in the power of data, of numbers, of carefully looking through their implications for helping to make decisions, for helping to guide programming, for helping to achieve impact. But we have to, this is a time where we've talked a lot about what does it mean to kind of do this, keeping in mind the real world effectiveness, the real impact that we want to see happen. That was great. Real world effectiveness, making it happen in the real world. And then we end up sometimes just saying that, giving lip service, and then coming back and saying, well, here's what the trial results expanded out and implemented at scale will end up doing. And that's not how it's going to work out. And we know this, we say this, but then what I'm saying is that coming out of this next couple of days, would love to see kind of a renewed commitment from modelers to really grapple with the challenges. Yes, you are. Grapple with the heterogeneity. Grapple with those things that we wish were simpler than they are. And to sit, because achieving the real world that we want to have, particularly in the way that the world is trending and tracking, is going to take us as far as saying, these things may be difficult. These things didn't show up in the trials, in the randomized control trials, but they can be identified, they can be enumerated, they can be studied, they can be tracked, and keeping track of them is part of our responsibility to the populations that we want to serve. We're all doing this because we care about people, and we believe that certain progress in health and development, economic development, access to care, access to modern contraception, access to nutrition matters. So that people can hear me. Yeah. And so I really want us to lean into that. We are dealing with a tremendous set of challenges. We also have an amazing set of opportunities. Looking around this room and seeing how this community continues to evolve. The great ideas that have come out. Read through the abstracts of the full set of abstracts over the weekend, and I was blown away. Wastewater surveillance, impact of nutrition. No. But it's going to be a great couple days. I really hope this is an opportunity not just to talk to the same communities, malaria modelers talking to malaria modelers, HIV to HIV, family planning to family planning, but to learn across there. Because when we look at, we're all grappling with some of these similar challenges of how do we take ideas that make a lot of sense, that work in trials, and actually say, what does this look like translated into the real world? And so very much excited to grapple with the challenges of a chaotic world with each of you, excited to learn from each other. Very best wishes for the next couple days. And thank you for tolerating and putting up with a introduced measure of chaos here this morning. So with that, I'd like to turn over to Jonathan, who is going to lead us through the plenary. And thank you all so much.
Great. Thank you very much, Phil. And thanks to Katerina, to our co-host. Good morning, IDMers. Come on, you can do better than that. Good morning, IDMers. Good morning. It's really great to be here. Thanks for the warm reception and your hospitality. It was great to, speak to some of you in the lobby. As you may have gathered, I'm not Paul or Anuradha. My name is Jonathan. I'm a senior or an associate partner at Albright Stonebridge Group, and also help to manage our global relationship with the Gates Foundation. My role here really is to frame and moderate the plenary session that we'll be having. But I really don't know if I can do a better job than Phil has done in sort of framing the conversation. So I'll try to keep this short. But yeah, Paul, Anuradha, myself all work at Albright Stonebridge Group. We are the world's leading strategic advisory and commercial diplomacy firm. And we want to start with the caveat, right, that we are not scientists. In fact, I think my greatest sort of qualification for being here is barely passing biology 101 in college. So the elephant in the room is, why are a bunch of commercial diplomats giving the plenary at sort of the keynote at a disease modeling conference? Phil has really laid out the reasons for that, right? It's because we live and you do really important work in an increasingly fractious and complicated world. We're here because as you do your work to eradicate infectious diseases, the world is increasingly interconnected, but at the same time, it's also increasingly fractured, increasingly complicated, and increasingly chaotic. And the political economy and sort of geopolitical shifts that we're doing, as Phil mentioned, will have really significant impacts for the work that you do. And if anything, right, we've seen that over the past few years in sort of the work that you've been doing. So for example, during the pandemic, we saw that, because of sort of growing fractiousness in the world and the fact that sort of there's a multipolar world, sort of growing distrust in international institutions. Rich countries were able to hoard vaccines, right, and not care about sort of the collective good of the world. At the regional level, for example, in Africa, we're seeing that as countries face significant fiscal headwinds and crippling debt, political actors are more incentivized to sort of invest in white elephant projects as opposed to sort of, the things that we care about and the public health investments that would lead to a lifetime of returns. And I think maybe most sort of acutely for the conversation we'll be having here today, and what I know will probably resonate for a lot of you in this room, we saw what happens just last month, we saw what happens when political regimes change. For example, in Afghanistan, where, the Taliban has now sort of halted the planned polio eradication campaign. So it's really important to talk about these trends and to anticipate them, right? Because I think the impact that we all seek happens when we mix, of course, the scientific methods and the modeling that you all do, but are very clear-eyed about some of the exogenous factors that could hamper sort of our service delivery and really getting, sort of solutions to the people that need them the most. So today I'm pleased to introduce two experts who've been on the front lines of helping the Gates Foundation sort of understand and navigate some of these political headwinds and tailwinds, challenges and opportunities. Today you'll be hearing from Paul Ansah, who leads Albright Stonebridge Group's Africa practice. Paul has extensive experience living and working on the continent, originally from Ghana. He's also lived in South Africa and supports our clients at the firm, including the Gates Foundation, to navigate risk and capture opportunity in sub-Saharan Africa's emerging markets. You'll also hear from Anuradha, who really has decades of experience at the intersection of the policy, business, and development worlds. Even though she's worked in business and policy, I think Anuradha's heart really is in development, and especially gender equality. She's a former Yale World Fellow and the Dean of a highly acclaimed All-Women's Management and Leadership Institute in India. So as you hear from them, please be thinking about the work that you do and the regions that you're focused in. But also, please keep your questions because they'll speak for about the first half of the presentation, and then we'll turn it over to you to answer your questions and to have an open discussion about some of these headwinds that we face, but also the opportunities that they might open up. So without further ado, let me turn it to Paul, who will speak to us about Sub-Saharan Africa. Thank you.
Thanks, John. All right. Good morning, IDMers. Good morning, IDMers. That was extremely impressive, wasn't it? How Phil tried to keep us cool and just keep talking through all of that. I'm also a dad. My kids are a little older now, and so I almost had forgotten how much chaos came with being a parent. But that was wonderful to observe. Well done, Phil. So my name is Paul Ansah, as you've been told. I'm a partner, as the slide says, an Africa practice lead at Albright Stonebridge Group, DGA. I'm African, born and raised. I'm also American, so I've had the pleasure of living and working on both sides of the Atlantic. I've been asked to speak today about, make sure this works, there we go. I've been asked to speak today about Sub-Saharan Africa within the context of this year's symposium theme, Global Public Health in a Chaotic World. While daunting, I think the theme resonates strongly, right? Since not so long ago, we were all living in a surreal, almost dystopian reality, right, in the pandemic. And even today, we are constantly inundated by reports of conflict, economic challenges, devastating effects of climate, social unrests, and the list goes on. Sometimes I have to just go on news detox breaks, right, just because I can't take it. It seems every morning something is new. And this piece of land called Sub-Saharan Africa is quite broad, as you might know, and so there's a lot to cover. And so, given the expansive range of political, economic, social, and environmental realities, the only way for us to cover this is just to focus, right? And so, and by the way, I think Jonathan's caveat initially was important, which is we are not scientists. I am a recovering engineer, but the last time I worked with numbers at that level of detail was a long time ago. So I can only claim it by my resume and my degree on the wall. But ultimately, I think what you'll find is that your work is hugely impactful. And I'm going to focus on the 6 countries that I understand are central to your work. So I'll talk about Nigeria, Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania, Ghana, Senegal. And today is Nigeria's Independence Day. So maybe I'll pick on Nigeria a little bit more than other countries. Okay, so even with this narrowed focus, there are still many realities that the continent faces. And so we'll try to cover as many of these as possible in the next 15 minutes and try to identify how these realities shape the development prospects of the continent. So let's start with the political landscape. Yeah. It's the right slide. Okay, so suffice it to say that stability and good governance are clearly essential to the development of the world. Right? But for many African countries, political instability remains a significant barrier to progress. While several countries have established meaningful democratic traditions, many still grapple with the legacies of colonialism, coup d'etats, military conflict, etc. Let's begin with the bright spots. So countries like Ghana, Senegal, and Nigeria have seen multiple peaceful transitions of power over the past 2 to 3 decades. Ghana, where I'm from, and I'll speak glowingly of it just for a little bit. For example, Ghana, I would say, well, let me just say that it's since returning to democracy in 1992, following years of military rule under a gentleman called Jerry Rawlings. Ghana has become a regional model for democracy, right, with successful peaceful transitions of power between the 2 major parties over 7 successful elections. My wife and I got married in Ghana in December. As many of us who have lived and worked outside, you tend to go to Ghana to get married at Christmas because most of your relatives and friends that are outside happen to be visiting, so they don't have to buy a ticket just because they like you. And so you get a good turnout. And so we decided to get married in December, but it was in 2008, and we weren't going to wait an extra year, but 2008 was election year, and Ghana's elections are in December. But the election is earlier in December, so we thought we'll be fine. Well, the election went to a runoff the day before our wedding. So ultimately, the opposition NDC party won narrowly. I'm talking about by 0.3% margin, right? And the incumbent NPP conceded the election. Now, just picture this wedding, and it's typical African wedding, right? Too many people, more people than I could even begin to think of recognizing. And looking back, I just remember, thankfully, most of the wedding had been successful. We had a good time. We're actually ready for people to go home. But people started to get text messages, right, that the final results were coming in, and it was really close. And so slowly people started to leave, right, rushing home because they were concerned that this could get violent, 0.3%. And many of our leaders tend to run multiple times before they eventually win. So the stakes are high, right? And so it was a scary moment. I distinctly remember that, but thankfully it all worked out well. Challenges, however, do exist. Recent democratic traditions notwithstanding, I said I'd pick on Nigeria. Sorry, Jonathan. Jonathan is Nigerian, so I'll have to apologize many times today. Nigeria still struggles with it's Africa's biggest democracy, right? And so its traditions are critical to progress for democracy across the continent. But beyond those traditions, the country has still struggled with internal divisions, right, which have created pockets of instability. In the northeast, the insurgency of Boko Haram has created a humanitarian crisis, displacing millions and undermining public safety. The government's efforts to combat this insurgency drains resources from essential services like healthcare, education, and infrastructure. Across the Sahel, extremist groups thrive in areas where governments have limited control, posing significant threats to regional stability. This, in part, has been a contributor to an unfortunate trend of coup d'etats in the Sahel that you might have heard of over the last few years. Ethiopia, another giant in East Africa, which until recently was seen as an emerging leader in African development, has struggled with its own internal challenges. The conflict in the Tigray region, which escalated into a civil war, disrupted years of economic growth and development. This conflict has displaced millions, led to widespread suffering, which is still ongoing, and destabilized one of Africa's most promising economies. It's an example of how quickly political instability can unravel years and years of progress. So the instability and insecurity prevalent in Africa's more complicated political environments present significant challenges for the effort to improve health outcomes. Challenges range from actual danger to health workers through to increased outbreaks of communicable diseases amongst displaced populations. Even in stable political environments such as Nigeria, Kenya, and Ghana, governance challenges lead to inefficient use of resources in providing essential social services such as healthcare. So I'll pivot now to the economic side of things. On the economic front, Africa is home to some of the world's fastest growing economies. That's something you've probably heard over and over again. But it's also a continent where poverty and unemployment remain entrenched, particularly among the youth, particularly among women and the youth. Let me be specific there. The disparity between Africa's immense economic potential and the reality of widespread poverty is one of the continent's most pressing issues. Nigeria again provides a telling example. As one of Africa's largest economies, Nigeria has had the potential to benefit from its vast oil resources, yet much of its large population live in poverty. The over-reliance on oil revenues has left the country vulnerable to fluctuations in global oil prices, making its economy unstable. Substantial governance challenges, and here I'm talking, being honest, about corruption and mismanagement of resources. These governance challenges have undermined, and I'm talking broadly now about the continent, and quite frankly, the rest of the world. But in particular, we're seeing this in a pronounced way in sub-Saharan Africa. These challenges have undermined efforts to diversify the economy and invest in sectors like healthcare, education, agriculture, manufacturing, which could create jobs and improve the standard of living. Contextual differences notwithstanding, I am always struck by the fact that Nigeria started producing oil in the late 1950s, which was a few years before the UAE, which started in the early 1960s. Yet Nigeria has not been able to realize a fraction of the developmental benefits that the UAE has, including investment in infrastructure, etc. Ethiopia, prior to its recent challenges, had one of the fastest growing economies, driven by a construction sector and strong agricultural output. The country's economic model, however, was and remains heavily reliant on state-driven development funded by high levels of debt. Although the country has attempted to open up its economy and encourage more private sector investment, political instability has derailed this effort. With many African countries heavily reliant on debt, global shocks such as the COVID-19 pandemic, the war in Ukraine, even the spillover effects of high interest rates in the developed world have pushed some countries into debt and many others to the brink of distress. Now, with constrained revenues, of course, and higher debt service costs, many African governments are spending less, as Jonathan said, on essential services such as health and education. As a point of reference, none of our focus countries have met the 15% budgetary spend committed to in the Abuja Declaration. This is spend on health, committed to in the Abuja Declaration in 2001. And Africa is losing well-educated young people to economic opportunity in the global north. Pivoting to social and cultural factors. Oh, sorry, I got a little behind on my slides there. So I'll just leave it here for a little bit, talking about the 15% spend. But I'll pivot to social and cultural factors. While there has been social progress in recent decades, deep inequities remain in Africa. The underfunding of health, education, and other social services means that countries struggle to meet the needs of rapidly growing populations. Access to basic services is uneven, with poor, rural, and marginalized communities facing significant barriers to education, healthcare, etc. Despite some progress, gender equality, or inequality rather, remains a significant challenge across the continent. In many countries, traditional social norms such as early marriage limit women's opportunities. Efforts to promote gender equality are underway in some countries, but progress is slow and uneven across the continent, and even within individual countries. In Nigeria, for example, conservative social and cultural norms in northern states make gender equality a much more difficult proposition than in the south of the country. I'm happy to say that the Gates Foundation is working with us at ASG to make progress in this area. We supported Nigeria's Federal Ministry of Women's Affairs to create a progressive women's economic empowerment policy, which was signed into law by the last president at the end of his term. And we continue to work with the support of the foundation to enable the domestication of the policy in key states. So Africa continues to have way too many maternal, neonatal, and child deaths. Since women have a direct impact on family health outcomes, it is essential that progress be made on gender issues in tandem with health interventions. Finally, I'll touch on environmental factors. Most of you are aware that Africa is among the regions most vulnerable to the harshest effects of climate change, even though the continent has contributed relatively little to the global carbon emissions. Rising temperatures, shifting rainfall patterns, and extreme weather events are having a profound impact on the continent's agricultural sector, which employs a large percentage of the population. In East and West Africa, the impact of climate change on agriculture has been particularly devastating as many rely on subsistence farming for their livelihoods. Nigeria, Senegal, Kenya, Ethiopia, Tanzania, all these countries have experienced severe droughts and/or floods in recent years, which have led to crop failures, food shortages, and the displacement of millions of people. Food insecurity and poverty, exacerbated by climate change, result in the deteriorating health of the citizenry and worsen the spread of diseases, many of which disproportionately affect women. The increasing frequency of droughts has also intensified conflicts over resources, particularly water and grazing land, exacerbating existing tensions. So you can see how everything is connected. The need for climate adaptation and mitigation is urgent in Africa. However, the continent's ability to respond to climate change is constrained by limited financial resources and technological capacity. International cooperation and support will be essential in helping African countries build resilience and adapt to changing climate. It's important to mention, though, that all is not gloomy on the African climate front. The continent presents significant opportunities for the global transition to a low-carbon world. First of all, Africa is rich in critical minerals, which you're aware of, necessary for EV and renewable energy technologies. The continent has vast renewable energy potential, wind and solar, and it offers carbon sequestration potential through its large tropical rainforests. So, finally, what is the way forward? Given that by 2050, 1 in every 4 human beings on this planet will be African, it's clear that a healthier world will be anchored by a healthier Africa. Data is essential in the effective delivery of health interventions, especially within the African context where resources are limited. Your important work at the IDM helps to predict where there's the need and what interventions will have an impact. Even with the range of challenges Africa faces, the continent is currently faced with a unique window of opportunity to push for a stronger health environment. This window is shaped by 3 main factors. First, the G20 presidency is coming to Africa for the first time in December. South Africa sees itself as a champion for the African continent, but as well as the global South. Its policy priorities are likely to be global governance and emerging market debt, the energy transition and climate adaptation, health and food security, as well as inclusive growth with a focus on women and youth. Secondly, something that encourages me is the fact that African youth are increasingly asserting their power and holding their governments to account. We've seen recent protests in Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, Senegal. In Senegal, the former president was prevented from running for a 3rd term. In Kenya, the president reversed course on a controversial finance bill and was forced to replace his entire cabinet. In all of this, technology has been a catalyst, enabling information sharing and mobilization. Finally, I just want to mention that in the effort to integrate the African continent through the African Continental Free Trade Area bodes well for creating a conducive environment for investment, especially private investment, across key sectors, including health. So, in conclusion, I'll say that the Gates Foundation continues to be a critical partner to the continent, to Africa, in its quest to improve the lives of its rapidly growing population. It is the evidence provided by the IDM that allows limited resources to be put to productive use. And I can't stress that enough. We've got to put the resources to the right use. There are multiple layers of issues, but informing decisions with data is the only place to start. Your work is more important now, more than ever, as Africa looks to make the most of this window to work towards a healthier continent. Thank you. On that note, I'll introduce my partner, Anuradha, and you'll find she's much more eloquent than I am. So that's why I went first.
It's an absolute honor for me and my colleagues to be here. To sit in a room full of people who come to work every day to make the world a healthier, happier, and safer place for each one of us. There's so much gratitude we feel just for the work that all of you do every day. I'm also pleased, like Paul and Jonathan, to be able to provide some context. There's 1.4 billion people where I come from. And in terms of what you do here, how it impacts or is likely to impact those lives, I'm going to take a small shot at sharing our story. And how we feel about the work that you do. India is mysterious, it holds promise, but it's also very bewildering. So it's all sort of rolled into one, and how do we make sense of some of this? And that's really the question. Why is it so difficult to wrap our head around what India presents, what it stands for? And I think the truth it's because contradictions just abound. There was all the chaos that we spoke about, and I was reflecting on Paul being an engineer, Phil spoke earlier, you are all modelers. I'm an economist by training, and I think the biggest lie on this planet is ceteris paribus. Like, we sit in our rooms and say, if everything else stayed the same, and I picked with some variables, what would the outcome be? But the truth is, nothing stays the same, right? And that sort of adds to the chaos with which we live. So I'm going to just share some stories with you. If you look at this, this is amongst the richest pieces of real estate in the world, belongs to one of the richest men on this planet. And on the other hand is a slide which shows that Mumbai is also home to Asia's largest slum, with a population of well over 1 million people. If you move on from that, women led India's space program. A large number of women were responsible for what happened. India's been globally celebrated for this very advanced space program. And on the other hand, we still have amongst the largest female populations that are just fighting for survival. It's really, food and health is hard to come by. If I move next, we have amongst the largest train networks in the world. It's the 4th largest in the world. We have very fancy trains now. They all look very sophisticated. There's going to be a bullet train in India. But equally, we have very antiquated systems of transport that take people from one place to the other, just focused on physical labor. And I think what I want to sort of summarize with these slides is, it doesn't matter what you say about India, the opposite is likely to be equally true. And how do you then stand in front of an audience and with definitiveness say, this is what it is? And I think data, as all of us know, there's a bunch of data that is factual, and then the story that you have the data say. That is our power, the narrative that we build around it. So if these are the contrasts that India lives with, how should we be thinking about public health? The thing that you are preoccupied with, solving for these problems, what should we think? And the contrasts that I'm talking about are present in the public health space too. Public expenditure on health, India sort of amongst the lowest in the world. Number of hospital beds per 1,000 people, woefully low. And out-of-pocket expenses as a percentage of healthcare expenditure amongst the highest in the world. Very short way. If health goes wrong in your family, there is very little that can keep you out of a debt trap or perpetual debt. But the same country delivered 2.2 billion vaccines were administered during COVID. We were able to become a hub for manufacturing of these vaccines. Smallpox, polio, guinea worm disease, maternal and neonatal tetanus, many things that we believe we have eliminated. Now, of course, I'm depending on government data, and we can argue that, there are still pockets where this exists, but the truth is that it is by and large, by way of definition, eliminated. And we are moving towards near elimination of malaria and leprosy. Now, if all this is true, what can we expect going forward? And as Paul caveated and as Jonathan caveated, I'm not a public health expert. But I think what we have done over the last few years as a public policy practitioner is to just look at a whole bunch of trends, look at a whole host of data, and put politics, economy, people, society, opinions, conversations in closed rooms. How do all of these come together to figure out what the future might hold? And like Paul said about Africa, I have to say about India as well, that we really feel like we have not been better poised to aspire towards achieving much better public health outcomes. And they often say that if all of this is true, then which of these Indias is likely to win in the future? And I'm reminded of an old story, and I'm sure many of you have heard it. It's this little boy with his grandfather. And the grandfather is telling him that, in each of us there are two wolves. One that has the baser human feelings, envy and jealousy and unkindness and ruthlessness. And then there is this other wolf that is kind and empathetic and compassionate and giving. And the little boy asks his grandfather, so which wolf will win? And he says, the one that you feed. And I feel like that's sort of where I stand about looking in India, because really the way we focus and what we want to do in the future is the India that will thrive. I'm called an optimism gorilla. It's very hard for me to see the dark side of stuff. But the truth is that if we pick a bunch of parameters and feel which are the predominant ones which are going to shape the India story, I feel more optimistic than I have ever felt. I've always felt optimistic, but I feel much more optimistic than I have. And I think this is because we are poised for better times. There are three things that make this story feel more true than the downside. One is that India has seen a very newfound confidence in itself, its aspirations to lead, definitely lead the global south, but also in a very focused manner, vigorous manner, wants to become a part of the developed world. We are tired of having been third world. Now we've been trying to, we've been in the developing bucket. I think there is a very strong desire amongst Indians, and especially the Indian government, to actually belong to the developed world. The second is we have an obsession with technology. India's obsessed with technology. And the third thing is a new focus on women-led development. And combined, the three of them offer, in my view, great hope, especially for public health. And why do I believe that? And I'll go to the political landscape the first. This ambition to lead globally, especially the global south, this is backed by political will and recent political stability, both of which poise us in a manner that better outcomes are ours to lose. I think there is so much that is set in, poised for growth or for uplift, that if we back off and we lose, it's really our doing. And if India wants to be a developed economy, this is not possible without significantly better health and education outcomes. We really can't afford to be so low on our human indicators and want to be a part of the developed world. So there's a huge drive and a recognition that this is no longer something that can be third, fourth, fifth priority when you want to chase growth or development. The national government in power right now has been in power since 2014. This is its third term. And in the most recently held elections, the majority for the leading political party has dropped, but they're still in power. It's a coalition government. But I think the piece that nobody disagrees on is growth and development for the country. So I think the pull, and many of you who are familiar with India will know that in the last 10 years, there's been a lot of concern around cultural and social factors. I believe that the coalition is great news because they're coming together on economic and growth issues and on human development issues, and the pieces that have gone to the back burner are the controversial cultural factors that used to worry a lot of us. Mr. Modi, who's the Prime Minister, this is his last term. And I think he wants to be known globally and in the country as someone who moved India into a different orbit. There's a heightened sense of urgency in the need to usher India into sort of sustained economic prosperity, not leaping from 8% to 4% to 5%. I think the doubts around how much you will grow really want to be put to bed. And like I said, this isn't possible without making public health a big pillar for our growth and development. I think there is a very important need coming out of years of being sort of the underdog. This need to be recognized globally for certain things. There's a word called Vishwaguru, which is leading the world. And I think what they did with the COVID vaccine, the manufacturing and the distribution, was a demonstration of wanting to be viewed a certain way in the world. And I think the third part of political will is India is a federal country. The states play a very big role. What has been done quite successfully is correlating productivity and economic productivity and prospects with health and education. So the states are seeing the connection, and I think there is a need to demonstrate almost competitively better prospects for public health and education if states want to prosper and become a part of the larger whole. This is India's new parliament. India got a lot of criticism for putting huge resources towards creating a new central vista in Delhi, this large expense on a parliament building. But I think this is a part of the and. It's not an or, poor or rich country or a poor or getting rich country. I think this is a part of the and. The confidence that you feel in being able to put infrastructure or public places that build public places that can get recognized as world class, I think is a very big part of that. And this desire to become what is called Viksit Bharat. Viksit is a word for developed, and Bharat is India. So this is one of the things that demonstrates India's deep desire to be a developed country. It also wants to own certain spaces and certain platforms. So I think the women-led development is something that it wants to capture. It came out of its G20 presidency. India, in some ways, really redefined what you could do as the president of the G20. The way they put agendas into the sort of the G20 and have led it gives us all a lot of hope in terms of what it commits to and what it can go forward with. The technology obsession. It feels like India's discovered the technology wand, and it's seen some very recent big successes, and there is an outsized role for technology, both for growth, development, and governance. And I'll give you 3 reasons why technology, I believe, has a very big role to play in where we can get. I think the first is, given how large geographically spread India is, there has been a huge challenge of access just to get to places. And technology makes some of that possible. The second is you don't have access to information and data. So you don't know where the problems are, and you don't know where you need to focus resources to be able to solve problems. That is the second thing that can be solved and is getting solved with technology. And the third thing is what has been a huge problem in India in terms of just efficiency of the use of resources, transparency in public funds. This is the third piece, governance, that has become possible. And the last part is digital transformation. I mean, India's digital public infrastructure, its UPI, which is for financial inclusion. These things have become globally acknowledged as huge successes. And I think there is a certain confidence and potential to lead that has become very obvious with these things. I just want to show you some data. The US, Indonesia, and Brazil combined, the population is just about equal to India's internet population. It's 820 million people who have access to smartphones and being connected to the net. Technology is really, the way it's been embraced. There is a word called mobile literacy in India. You may be illiterate otherwise, but you can transact on a phone, you can communicate on a phone, you can add and subtract on a phone. So you'll see this, the rural setting, but the use of technology. More than 1 billion transactions last year just with the Unified Payments Interface, which is digital transactions, and that have been made possible. The last piece that I want to talk about is gender. I think there is finally recognition in India that the importance of women as voters and therefore women-led development needs to be brought into focus if India has to move to the developed world as a part of the developed bloc. And I believe that with greater voice and greater resources, women will demand far more improved health outcomes. And this is because they bear the brunt. One, they are the sufferers, and two, they bear the brunt of poor public health outcomes because they are the primary caregivers. So in terms of, as India wants to take lead in key areas, championing gender is becoming a very important part of the public policy and political narrative. In G20, women-led development became a term that was used very frequently across the board by the government. And the question really, I mean, it should be in all your minds because it's in my mind very often is this lip service? Or are we at a genuine inflection point? Politicians globally have become very smart. I think they let people play to the voter, to the normal public, to the common man, to get political mileage. Is it true, or is it? Are we at a real inflection point? And I think that this is probably a point where we are beyond lip service, because people are just becoming smarter. I mean, Paul referred to African youth demanding better outcomes. I think in India it's definitely the youth, but women are becoming a much larger voice in terms of being heard, especially young women. I run a college it's an all-women's management program, and I think you just sit in and hear the conversations. If they are even remotely representative of the country, I'm very hopeful of the future that we have. Women voters are getting recognized as an important political force, and therefore, I mean, India's passed a women's reservation bill, 33% in all kinds of political platforms. And I think that comes together to say this is probably beyond lip service. So the data is not great. India is very behind on female labor force participation, even though there's an uptick after the pandemic. But I think the truth is here that solving for this is no longer believed to be optional. I think one is the recognition that if you get more women in the workforce, what it will do for the economy. Two, the understanding based on research that 8% growth that is important for sustained economic prosperity is not possible without more women in the workforce. So it's coming from the Prime Minister, it's coming from all sort of other quarters that we really have to take much greater cognizance for women-led development. So all these factors coming together, I think, just augur better. And with all of these factors, what does this really mean for solving huge social problems at scale? We experiment. I think one of the most noteworthy tools in the Indian government's bag has become a very interesting fluidity in the way it looks at public funds, where you put public funds. I just want to share some data. In public-private partnerships, airports, universities, and electricity. In all of these three, over the last decade, public spending has broadly stayed stable, but the outcomes in terms of growth and penetration have gone through the roof. And our view is that this is because of this very interesting phenomena that we're observing in India, where public spending has become fluid. Government sees where funds are available to solve for large problems, and it takes its money to where others are not putting their money. And I'll give you a very quick example from many years ago when aviation was just about opening up in India. I remember meeting a member of parliament from the very remote northeast. And the government had started to give licenses to airlines, saying that if you wanted a lucrative destination, then you needed to also service a remote destination. So in order to get the license, these aviation companies would say, okay, I'll serve the Northeast. Now, if somebody said they'll serve the Northeast, the government would move to another remote area where there was no bidder. This member of parliament told me that they get the license and then they cancel the flight every day, as mentioning a technical snag. Right? But I think the government is smarter, and there is much greater penalties for violating norms with which you come and get licenses and promise to serve a social priority. So what we feel has become very true is that if there is good corporate or not-for-profit citizens that are willing to step in to help solve a national priority, the government is willing to give you space to do that. In health, the Gates Foundation has done fantastic work in India. It's not very common for a foundation or any third party, especially foreign, to get the respect in a space where they will look for opinions or for advice. I think in health that's very evident. So we feel very, very fortunate to work with you, and sort of end with the fact that the public health space, I think, is happy to be guided by inputs, expertise, and resources that will come from institutions like the Gates Foundation and IDMers. And therefore, we are very hopeful of moving towards a Viksit Bharat, which is a developed country. So with all the other analysis and assessment that I've done, there is no way that we can stop crossing our fingers, because a lot in India in the midst of chaos depends on good luck. So with that, thanks very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Anuradha. If I could get you to stay up there and have Paul join you, we'll open it up for questions. And there are no questions in the chat yet. And maybe before I go to the audience, I'll lead with one. So, of course, we're talking about this more chaotic world, and I think one of the functions of that chaos is unpredictability. So even just standing here today, a year ago, if we were having this conversation, I don't think many of us would have predicted, for example, that we could be on the brink of war in the Middle East in the way that it's played out, or, that, for example, Prime Minister Modi would have lost as much ground in the parliament as he did. Or, for example, that Kenyan youth who were very supportive of President Ruto would go into the streets, right? So I know we're not scientists and you are not fortune tellers either, but looking at 2025, what do you think will be sort of the wild card political economy moment in India and sub-Saharan Africa, if you had to sort of make a guess?
In our business, there's always this wonderful initial disclaimer, and then you are asked to dust off your crystal ball and proceed to predict the future. So we've gotten used to it. Maybe I'll start. I think I talked about the G20 and the agenda. I think debt in emerging markets is going to be covered. I think focus on climate, focus on energy is going to be covered. So your question is, what are we not paying attention to, right? What should we focus a little bit more on? From an African standpoint, I will say stability. That for me is the biggest thing, right? Over the past few years, we've seen a series of coups d'etats, as I talked about earlier. So the Sahel has become hugely unstable. I talked about the north of Nigeria. The Horn of Africa has really a brewing crisis in the making. And in the east of the DRC, right, we're seeing instability lead to kind of that being the center for the spread of Mpox. And so for me, stability by far is the biggest thing. And I'll tie that to something that's talked about a lot, but I don't think is given enough emphasis. We're not seeing enough results. This is what leads to all these young people sometimes taking very dangerous journeys to try to leave the shores of Africa, which is just creating economic opportunity for Africa's youth, right? A lot of these ills just come from folks having idle hands, right? So real economic opportunity, meaningful employment, and helping prepare our young for the jobs that are coming. I think these should be critical focus points and not just talking points for our politicians.
Right. So I want to say, Jonathan, that the notion of risk, when you look at India inwards and you look at India outside in is quite different. I think within India, there's very little that feels like risk because we are so used to chaos. And you're so used to sort of completely unexpected things happening and finding a way around. There's a very interesting term that is used in India very often called jugaad, which basically means a workaround. So I think very little phases India out internally. But I think what happens is because, say, for example, what comes out of global donors or global investors for India, in that context, you have to then start thinking of what could be perceived as a risk. I think I will take a leaf out of Paul's book and say that stability, although we don't see it going off because it's a coalition government, is there something that could dislodge it? If that is, there will be some setback. But I really do feel like the next few years are much more driven by the opportunity to actually grow and to be able to find a way to continuously feed the opportunity as to be held back by any potential risks.
Thank you. So we'll start with a question here and then go over there.
Hello, thank you very much for both presentations. Santiago Asdeu from Argentina. To Professor Anuradha, you mentioned the federal organization of India and the positive correlation of regions with more productivity, with better health outcomes. Almost half of the world lives in countries with federal organization, some type of federal organization. And how to avoid inequalities. For example, in Latin America, from where I come from, we're finding an increment in inequalities at a subnational level, where regions that have richness, oil or gas, etc., they can invest more in health, for example, but other regions inside the same country are not getting a redistribution of that richness. So that is the political question. And then we have the technical question when we have to assess what is the average. No, this is as an average for the country, or we go to the extremes where we have very poor areas that can't afford to purchase some goods. Both questions for you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think I mean, it's a very valid question, but again, I have a slightly controversial take on it because I feel like if the baseline, and the inequality question very often is also in a per capita GDP kind of state, right? That the rich are getting richer. The gap between the lowest income strata and the highest income strata is becoming much bigger. Now, I personally don't have an issue with that as long as the lowest income strata are far better than they were. I mean, the house that I showed you, if there were hundreds of those houses, but everybody else has had decent health and education outcomes, I wouldn't worry about that. I would worry about the inequality amongst states or between people if the poorest were getting poorer and the richest were getting richer. That's not the trend. So everybody is on an upswing. Some are growing and becoming richer faster and more than others. The other thing with our kind of federal structure is that the center still controls a bunch of taxes and resources which they can allocate to backward areas to bring them up to speed. So it's a little bit of equity versus equality. And I think those options are taken by the government to bring really backward areas up to speed. I'm sorry, your second question was?
The technical ways to assess which is the average.
Average, yeah.
The average country.
Yeah, no, I think that again, while you mention that at a national level, I think anyone who knows the country will know that there isn't any notion of investing in India or working in India. You really figure out which geography you will work in. for most regions and go there. So, for example, the Gates Foundation will decide which states to work in, depending on how the human indicators there work. So I think there's reasonable clarity on the, yeah.
My name is Samuel Idi. I'm also coming from Ghana. So this question will go to you, Paul, directly. I think this has been a very big issue currently in Ghana. In your speech, you did talk about, Africa being rich, endowed with a lot of resources, natural resources. We talked about climate change and its impacts on the people. Currently in Ghana, there is this issue of galamsey, which is illegal mining activities, that is degrading our environment so much. And there have also been issues about involvement of the government or the political elites in these activities. I want to get your perspective on how do you think the government of Ghana can handle this issue, balancing the economic as well as the environmental, issues, and then the health implications of these activities that are polluting almost all the rivers that we can boast of in Ghana are contaminated with these chemicals that are coming from these activities of illegal mining. Just to hear from you, what's your perspective on this? Thank you.
Sama Medase. Anuradha has been speaking her native tongue a bit, so I was looking for an opportunity. Thank you for that question. This is a big problem, no question. And it's something that has been building over the years, right? It's been talked about, it comes and it goes as an issue. But lately, it's become a huge focus. I'll give you an honest answer. Ghana's election, remember I talked about 2008, it was when I got married, elections then, it's on a 4-year cycle, so we're due for elections this year. Our government has to change. Unfortunately, there's nothing else I can say about that. There's been close to 8 years of opportunity. There have been good plans laid out initially. There's been more than enough talk about the impact of some of these practices. You talked about the environmental impact and the knock-on effect on health of communities impacted here. But I gave that answer because there's been enough opportunity for action to be taken, and we are where we are. And it goes back to something I said before around governance. As an African, and as someone that has spent most of my working career focusing on developing the continent in one way or the other, this is one of the biggest externalities, at least for me, right, that some of us that are trying to encourage investment into the continent are faced with. Because there is an accepted way of doing things that has to change. And I'll come back to what I said before. Africa's youth. Ghanaians are known to be relatively docile. But our people are taking to the streets now. We're having real protests now. We've got to hold our governments to account. In this election, I won't pick any sides, but I hope that the people will speak loud and clear as to what they're willing to accept and what they're not willing to accept. And going forward, we can put at the top of the agenda, because as I said before, climate is on the top of any kind of discussion at the multinational level. When you look at private investors and they're looking to come in, capital is just interested in, first of all, obviously return, but where can we actually make a difference, particularly around climate. And so everyone's focused on that. I think our leaders need to take that cue and actually start taking action in that regard.
Thank you. Yeah, actually, my question is on gender equality, and I think she addressed very well, where she said gender equality is the next frontier for development and economic, actually progress and economic development. So maybe my question will go again to Paul. My name is Samuel Mwalili from Kenya. How do we address the issue of gender equality in Africa, given that we know that much of it actually is hidden by the cultural practices, where the woman or the women, for that matter, even are not aware that they're actually oppressed. And I'm saying this because I know due to some cultural practices, either in Kenya, you give an example of Nigeria, maybe Somalia, maybe Ethiopia, where actually we are fighting for people who are not aware that actually they are really oppressed by these cultural practices. So how do we overcome that? And maybe to our colleague from India, how do we learn from India, where there's a huge diversity in terms of addressing the gender issues in Africa? Thank you.
No, thank you, Samuel. It looks like the day of Samuels and questions. I appreciate that. That's a critical question, and I'll just start by saying that, of course, I don't have the lived experience of a woman, but I had lunch yesterday with a woman, an African woman, who also shared the same sentiment, which was, I didn't know until later on in my life that women face challenges. I come from a family where the women accomplished everything. Everything. I mean, it wasn't even something that occurred to me as a potential reality. So to your point around awareness, it's something that I can testify to as someone that grew up on the continent. And you say women not being aware. My mother was extremely well accomplished. Founded Ghana's first mortgage bank. But there were some things she would say to me sometimes that made me scratch my head and say, that is kind of the opposite of what you would think someone that powerful would say on behalf of women. That goes back to your point around cultural norms. But what I will say is that, first of all, when you look across the continent, it's difficult to answer this from an African perspective because it just differs widely. I talked about Nigeria and what it is like in Lagos, right, versus in Maiduguri. They are not the same thing. And so my answer to you will be, we've got to take a local approach and a culturally sensitive approach to our messaging. And we've got to be realistic around what success looks like. You can't go from 0 to 100, right, in an environment that just needs to go to 2 or 3. And so I think this is where the effort has to be curated for the environment. I don't know if there's anything you'd add to that.
Yeah, I can just, I think there's two things that I would like to add. One, that social change, I agree with Paul, is something that takes time. My view is that there are many women in the world, especially younger women, who are not willing to wait. So I think some of that charge is coming from the fact that media is porous across borders, and therefore women who till now didn't really realize that they were subjugated or that they didn't have the freedoms that they would want, I think that information is becoming available. How quickly you can embrace it, do you have the moral, political, social, physical, financial courage to be able to ask or make those demands, I think will determine the pace of change. But I do think that the environment, again, is very ripe for that. And I'll give you one very quick example. I get invited to speak to, the top companies in India, the 4, 5, 6 largest conglomerates have almost no senior women in their workforce. Now, I was referring to data a little bit earlier, saying data can say anything, right? So there's a lot of data today outside saying diverse companies do better. If you have more women in the workforce, you'll be more successful. Those guys are telling me I'm the richest man in the world without women in my workforce. What data are you talking about? right? I don't need to do better than I'm doing, I'm fine. So I think, one, the narrative that there are some things we have to do because it's the right thing to do, as opposed to trying to convert people to do this because it's economically more successful or whatever, because I think we can slice the data both ways. So I think there is a force in the world. So when I went to talk to these people, I basically started with saying, how many hours do you work? Now, this is one of those Indian companies that is incredibly successful, full of men, middle-aged and more. They do 18-hour, 16-hour, 14-hour days without a problem. So I said, how do you manage to do that? Do you have any other responsibilities? Many of them said, we have children, we have aging parents, whatever. I said, how do you manage to do that? It's because you have a wife at home. The truth is that that wife is no longer willing to carry the entire responsibility as a caregiver. So it's not anymore the opportunity or the choice for people who are incumbents to actually give up space for the other person. That they're not going to have that space, because other people are vacating a space that if it's not taken up, you can't be working 14 hours a day. And I think the moment there is room for economic power, I'm going to go one step ahead of education. I think till a decade ago, it was believed that if you educated your women, things would start to change. I don't think education changes. I think it is from education to economic empowerment. The moment you have resources of your own, the world looks different. In India, there was an experiment, and so I wanted to say that, the only thing you can learn from India is that legislation actually is a very important first step, because even before your mind has changed, if you know it's illegal, you have to stop doing it. So at least the quantum reduces, whether it is child marriage or it is child labor or whatever it is. Societies can believe it's okay, but if the law bans it, then that change starts to happen. So in India, we had 33% reservation, and I was told in those early days, these are all props. The father-in-law or the father or the husband or the brother puts up this woman for political power, and they actually control it. It took one generation, like one cycle. The moment women realized that they had power, doesn't matter who propped them up, it starts to change. So I think legislation is a very important thing to work towards for this change. Sorry for the very long answer.
Yeah, no, spot on. I just want to echo something that links back to your work and the foundation, which is just pushing for gender disaggregated data, right? We need the evidence. If you're going to hold folks to account, we need the evidence that makes this more than just an ideological debate, right? And I think that's absolutely crucial.
We have time for one more question.
Hello, good morning, everyone. I'm Valentina. I'm from Italy, but I'm actually based in Brazil, so I'm kind of just dual position. And thank you so much for the contextualization. It was very nice to hear updated information about the situation in these 5 or 6 countries in Africa. I'm from India. I do have to apologize because mine is more a comment than a question. And also apologize to everyone because it's a little bit disruptive, but I promise it's meant to be constructive to the conversation. So one thing that struck me was about what you presented was not mentioning the role of the richer countries in what we see in these phenomena. And if I can give more specific examples, one is the comparison between the oil industry in Nigeria and the United Arab Emirates. I thought, what's the difference between them? Their colonial history, or lack thereof, in the case of one, right? So in Brazil, there's a lot of discourse about the current impacts of colonization, how till today we're still seeing the influence and the resulting inequalities, especially race inequalities, but also obviously gender inequalities also come into the story. So I'm just wondering, and another thing was about the kind of conflicts that were mentioned. Again, like there's an arms industry behind them. And we know, as an economist, I know that demand and supply are interlinked, and that if, for an arms producer, you need to have demand for weapons. So And they're kind of not really mysterious, the fact that wars keep on arising left, right, and center, because obviously there is people out there that need it for their own economic growth, basically. So I also want to thank the organizers for giving space for a more political kind of conversation. Obviously, a lot of people here are more into the numbers, but we need to contextualize those numbers and see what world they're reflecting. And anything you can comment on this, and whether there is a look on how European countries, North America, they have an impact on the things that we're seeing in these countries that are struggling to kind of improve their welfare, the welfare of their populations.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, and I appreciate your candor there, and you're spot on. But just given the time we have, we could branch into that discussion, right? And we can go on and on. Yes, there are many other countries that have an influence across the continent, right? And it's not just the West, right? We're seeing the Middle East. When you look at the Horn of Africa and what's happening, we're seeing influence from the Middle East, right? There's a lot of talk about Russia's role on the continent, and so a lot goes back to kind of these countries coming out of the colonial era, and that window, right, between the late 1950s and now, and what has happened. I gave the Nigeria example around oil, and I did mention that, contextual differences aside, right, because there's a whole lot we can get into. But the point was simply, with the two countries producing such large quantities of oil, right, Nigeria could have done more with its oil. It's that simple point, right? Population sizes are drastically different, and so you can't compare the two and what each country has had to deal with. But also the history and the influence is there. I talked about debt, right, and that cycle. Well, that's part of what's hindering most African countries, right, is this challenge and this cycle of debt that they can't get out of. And this is why I mentioned that South Africa is laser focused, and it's building, quite frankly, on Brazil to draw attention to the need for this. And we're seeing things slowly move forward on the global scale, right? Africa was just given membership, or the AU was given membership, right, in the G20. So little by little, we are getting a seat at the table. What we have to do, yes, there are external reasons for some of the challenges, but there are also internal reasons. And I focus on the internal reasons because that's something we control as Africans, right? Let's fix our affairs at home while continuing to push for a change to some of these more systemic structures that continue to kind of keep the continent where it is.
Anuradha, I don't want to put you on the spot, but India was also colonized, so do you have any thoughts on that?
On what she said?
Yeah.
I think it takes a long time to recover from those things. And to just go back to the starting point, like what you can expect from sort of donors or whatever, I think people, countries, you just get fed up of waiting for someone else to make the change. So to Paul's point, what you can do for yourself, you get started. And I think that, again, what gives me hope is that, and I remember reading this book some time ago, written by an economist, where he said that ultimately resources will go where there are people. So given that money ultimately drives the world, the richer countries and their companies will want to go where people are, because it doesn't matter how rich you are, you can eat only that much food as an individual. So food companies, whatever it is. And I think that is the big hope for most of Asia and Africa, that ultimately resources will go where the people are. So it's the transition that we have to find the resilience to be able to deal with or to cope with. And I think just one more point that I want to make is that resources that were earlier, for parts of the world like ours only came from sort of donor money. There's so much competition in that world. There are so many other sources of finance that I think if you have a good plan and if you have a good execution strategy and it comes with a certain intent, I think the resources and the kinds of pools that have become available have also changed and grown significantly. So the older expectation that the richer countries need to do something for us, I think they need to do something for the universe. I think those equations are changing so rapidly, or if not so rapidly, so significantly, that the options available to poorer countries and people are significantly more than they used to be. So it again makes me a little bit more hopeful than the past.
Great. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but thank you all for your time, and can we please give Paul and Anuradha a hand?